In this video, we're going to take a look at Andy Harris's example code for Chapter 2, where he introduces some concepts of JavaScript. Now, I've already made another JavaScript video, which you will find available to you, that is also similar to some of this, but you need to make sure you spend the time to read what is in Chapter 2, read through the content, and open these files and try to analyze what is going on. Even try to change the code, analyze what's happening. If you break it, you just download the files again to see what's happening. So ultimately, at the end of this chapter, he will show you how to make what he calls a word story, which is a really helpful and important example to you, because by the time you get through the word story example, which is at the end of this chapter, you will have an excellent example for your first project for the class. Your project must not and should not look the same as this, but the concepts are the same. So I'm just going to go in and look at code, which I've shown you how to access code, but just to kind of remind you, I've placed all the game to Chapter 2 development files here, or you can also go to course content and then go to HTML5 game development for dummies, and you can download all the chapter content files right here under text resource files. So that's another place to get to them. But back in week 1, we're looking at Chapter 2, and I'm going to be going through the example files that he gives us in that chapter. So I've already opened all those files. I've opened all the HTML files just to kind of analyze specifically this, and I'll also look at some JavaScript files as well here in a moment. But I first want to look at alert. So alert is a very basic, easy way to show how JavaScript works. So this is just a pop-up box, alert box kind of thing. We probably won't use this much, but you can use a pop-up box with JavaScript. To just see how this works is when the user clicks on the button, it launches a built-in understood function called an alert. It's basically just an alert box, but this is sort of kind of JavaScript running in the background. Again, we're probably not going to use this much, but he's just showing you how to get the user to interact with the page. We will almost always use input boxes, which you'll see mentioned here. So here, the user can type into this input with an ID called text name, and then there is a submit button. So just to show you what this page looks like, it looks something like this. Now I believe right now I can type in something and I can click submit, but nothing's going to happen, and that's because there's no JavaScript on this page that will handle what happens with that input. So if we go to the next example and look at greet, now we're going to add some JavaScript. So now we have pretty much the same file that we see here, but now when I click on submit, I can type something in here and I can click submit, and what's going to happen is this alert box is going to pop up only when I click on the greet button. So I'm going to run this file, and I'm going to type in my name and click submit, and I can see that this box pops up, but the only time it happens now is when I click the greet button, and it is running specifically JavaScript inside the script tag. Notice that here in this example we have a type attribute. We really don't need this anymore. This is kind of an old school way of doing this. We really don't have to do that because JavaScript is kind of the assumed language that we would use. So now we're going to be more specific, because we're still not really using this input field. Look, I can still run this, and I don't really have to type anything in here, and I can click submit, and this box is still going to look exactly the same. So now we're going to move on to looking at greet name, and now when you click the button, it's going to launch a function called greet, which is up here, which is really the same thing we had before, but now that function is going to use the values that the user types in. So now we get a little bit more full interaction. Now the page looks exactly the same in HTML, but what's very different is now the JavaScript is going to pull in by that ID called txt name, which is right here. It's going to pull in the value of what the user typed in, put it in a JavaScript variable called username, and it's going to use that for its alert box. So now when I click submit, it says hi Sally, because it's pulling in what is inside this box. Now if I type nothing in there and click submit, it will still work. It just says hi and it has a space because it's expecting the user to have entered something there. So I can make this look a little bit better, and I can now, rather than use an alert box, I can use output. I can use this built-in JavaScript utility called innerHTML with a ID that I call output and a JavaScript variable called output. So now I'm going to change an element with the name of ID, the ID name called output, which is going to be this div, which right now it just starts empty. But when the user clicks the greet button, it's going to build this string hi username exclamation point, and it's going to put it using innerHTML. It's going to put it inside the ID called output, which is this guy. So this looks a little bit different for HTML. It's a little hard to see, but the word empty is here. And now when I type in my name and click submit, it will now, rather than using the alert box, it puts that output in the ID, the div ID called output. So it's now going to use this div ID called output and overwrite the innerHTML. InnerHTML inside between this opening and close of this div tag for the ID called output. Okay, so we can also do a little bit of CSS with this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just be aware that you can actually change this, make this look a little bit nicer with CSS. So we'll look at what this looks like. This doesn't have a lot of CSS, but just for alignment, and you can see how that looks a little bit better. But we can also move this JavaScript code. We can move this JavaScript code to an external JavaScript file. And this is how we would do that. So now the script tag, which actually, I'll see if I can enlarge that back. Well, this is actually the opening of the script right here. This is the opening of the script tag. And again, I really don't need type anymore, but I would need src because I need to tell HTML, I need to say, hey, where do you get this JavaScript code? Well, you're going to look for a file called greet.js. So greet.js must be loaded in the same folder. So all of this stuff is in my chapter 2 folder. It might be a little hard to see, but here's that greet.js file. It lives in the same house in the chapter 2 folder. It lives in the same house as the HTML file, which is greet_extern.js. That's the file I'm looking at. So I'm actually looking at right now, I'm looking at this file. That's the HTML file, and that HTML file needs to access greet.js, which is right here. So I'm going to open that puppy up in Notepad++. Now the code looks a little different because all we're looking at here is this is straight up JavaScript code. That's all we see here is JavaScript code. So this greet_extern.js HTML file needs to access greet.js, which is a JavaScript file. JS is a JavaScript file. And here is that file. So really, this is not going to do anything different from what we just saw previously, except it is set up differently because the HTML file is going to access an external JavaScript file to do its thing. So now when I open this, it's going to look pretty much the same way, But when I run it, it's still going to really look the same way. But what's really different here is the fact that the JavaScript file is external. It's in its own file. So we will actually graduate to that eventually, and that's kind of why he's showing you that. So the last example in chapter 2, which is really, really important, is this file called WordStory. You'll notice that WordStory, if we look at it in HTML, it's basically a bunch of input boxes where the user can type in a boy's name or a girl's name, geological formation, like, I don't know, a mountain, whatever. Excuse me, it asks for a verb, liquid. You can see the parts of speech that we would be entering as a user into these input boxes. On the HTML side, we have a bunch of labels that tell the user what to do, and then a respective input box with an ID for each of those input boxes. We also have a button that will launch Tell Story when the user clicks on the button Tell the Story. There's also an output div, an ID with output for a div that's going to be built. This story is going to be built and displayed here. But there's no JavaScript here. All the JavaScript is in a separate JS file called WordStory. So I have to go find in the same house, they live in the same house, same folder, I got to find WordStory.js. Now there's also CSS here, which I'm not really looking at. You can see there's external CSS going on here, and you can look at that if you want. But I'm focusing on the JavaScript code. And here's all that JavaScript code. So you can see for each input box, I need to create a way to make that connection with a variable. And then for each of those variables, I need to get the value and store that in a JavaScript variable. So, like for example, the variable boy is going to grab the value for txtBoy, and txtBoy is connected to the document's ID called txtBoy. So then I'm going to use those variables inside my output. Here I am building a story. A variable called story is going to get, $1 means get, I'm going to get what is in boy. Concatenate space and space. Concatenate what is stored in the variable girl. Concatenate space went space up space the space. I finish this statement, and on the next line of code, I'm going to say, I want story to get more stuff. So plus equals means take what is already in story and concatenate more. We're going to continue to build our string with what is stored in geol. That's a variable, JavaScript variable. Concatenate more, space to space. Concatenate what is in verb. So all this code, I'm building a long string. It's a story. Look, I can even put HTML code inside a string. So this will add 2 empty lines after the sentence with the word liquid, the variable of what's in liquid. And all of this is going to end up being assigned to inner HTML for an ID called output. That's what my JavaScript does here. So if I go back to WordStory, sorry about that, my dog is barking. If you go to WordStory, I can fill this out. I'm just going to put in some dummy data here just to show you what happens. But you want to try to test this, test it out, make sure it's going to work. And when I click Tell the Story, it's going to build that story in that div ID called output. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a very good example of a project that you will be asked to do in the near future. When you do that project, you should make yours look different than this. You should not just simply grab this code and paste it and rewrite over it, but use it as a very good example for what you're code should look like, because it is an excellent example of what you are going to do.